Do you think we're having a mental health crisis?
Sure.
Is it only getting worse? Is it getting better? What do you observe?
It's getting worse. We absolutely have a mental health crisis. It is absolutely getting worse.
Why?
I think we are substituting dopamine for many of the things that make us happy. I think that's a huge part of the root of it. I think there are a couple of other basic things that are going on. So one is we're altering our dopaminergic circuitry. One is that the world we live in drastically alters our sense of identity. So like human beings evolved to live in like tribes of like 300. So when you think about like the number of romantic rejections you could receive over the course of your life, it's like maybe 20 or 30. Like over the course of your life, like that's what we evolved for. But in today's world, you can like get onto a dating app and like get rejected by hundreds of people within like 24 hours. So there's certain things that technology is doing, which our brains were not designed to exist at this scale. So like dating apps is a good example of that. Other examples are just if you think about, are you proud of what you've accomplished in life? So if we think about a total, like a total group of 300 people, being proud of what you accomplished is pretty easy. But now you're comparing yourself to like people from like 8 billion people across the planet. Whatever you do, there's going to be someone who's doing it better than you are, right? So I think there's some fundamental things about the way that our society has changed, which predispose us to worsening mental health.
What percentage of the population do you think suffers from a mental disorder?
50 to 70%.
So you're saying our biology has not caught up with our environment, and so we can't really tolerate it, and then there come a lot of issues, mental disorders that come with that.
Yes. So I think what's going on is like, so if you think about like cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? So if everyone starts smoking, a lot of people are going to get lung cancer. Right now, what we have is something like technology that is pervasive, affects everyone, and it comes with certain mental health consequences. The good news is that if you understand what tech is doing to our brains, you can reverse those effects. And we're seeing this happen organically too with like the rise of mindfulness, for example.
But it's weird because I think a lot of people, myself included, think that if you have depression, if you have anxiety, BPD, or bipolar, any of these ailments, that's something that's kind of in your genes and you have it for your entire life and you're constantly fighting it. But it doesn't really make sense that if it's our environment, then wouldn't it be onset then? And so if it's onset, so we become depressed or we become anxious as we get older, then wouldn't you then be able to solve it?
Okay, so let's talk about genes and environment and whether depression, anxiety, et cetera, can be solved. So I believe that the majority of mental illnesses can be put into sustained remission. So that's not cure because we don't say that. But in my life and in my patients, I think I've had patients who are in like sustained remission for a decade, haven't had an episode of depression, are within the regular range of like normal anxiety, so they don't have like pathologic anxiety, who have diagnoses and came in with a diagnosis. So I think for the most part, mental illness can be cured. Even things like personality disorders. So if you look at borderline personality disorder or BPD, 96 to 99% of people with BPD will not test positive for it 16 years later. So 50% of people with BPD no longer fit the criteria in 2 years.
What happens? How does it just go away? Is it just the brain gets more developed?
No. So let's talk about genetics and environment, okay? So what we have to understand is your genetics are a predisposition. They're a vulnerability. And then your genetics intersect with your environment to create an illness. So just to give you a simple example, we can test your genes for allergies, right? But if you live in a country where that allergen doesn't exist, you don't have allergies, even though you have the genetic predisposition. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So what we know about mental illness, and this is what's really confusing for people, is you absolutely have a genetic predisposition, but then it requires a certain environment to bring that out. So a really good example of this is if we look at something like, bipolar disorder. So one of the most common causes of first episode mania, when someone has their first manic episode, is pregnancy or childbirth. So that person had the bipolar genes all along. They were born with them. But the stress of pregnancy or childbirth triggers a manic episode. The part of our brain that governs sleep is different with people with bipolar disorder. So what happens is you need the right kind of stressor or right kind of stress to trigger the bipolar disorder to become active. And pregnancy is like at the top of the list. Childbirth is at the top of the list. Which conversely, if I have patients with bipolar disorder, so I once worked with someone who's a very successful PhD, just awesome researcher, and his main thing was sleep. So we know that one of the risk factors for triggering mania is like impaired sleep. So as long as he was sleeping really well, we came up with a regimen where basically he's only taking medication when he travels for international conferences. And as long as he regulates his sleep well and does a couple of other things, takes the medication when he's traveling and anytime he's jet lagged, basically hasn't had a depressive or manic episode in like 3 or 4 years. So you can absolutely correct for what is going on, I think, most of the time.
So if arguably a majority of people will experience some sort of mental disorder throughout their life, 50 to 70%, you said. How do you know if you have one, if it's not like, painfully obvious? Or should it be painfully obvious?
And how do you differentiate between just like a few off days versus like I'm having a breakdown?
Yeah, so these are fantastic questions. And I think there's just so much misunderstanding around mental health, mental illness. So let's start with, how do you know if you have a problem? So generally speaking, in psychiatry, the way that we differentiate between sadness and depression is impairment of function. Basically, like, you can be sad, but if you're able to function, like if you're able to fulfill your daily duties, take care of your family, go to work, you like shower every day, or if that's normal for you, like, you're able to like maintain hygiene and things like that, we don't call that an illness. So we in psychiatry, we have to find some kind of defining line, right? Where do we draw the line? And what we've decided to do as a field is impairment in function. So whatever is going on with you, is it causing problems in your life? If the answer is yes, it tips us far closer to mental illness. Now, the really tragic thing is that there are a ton of people out there who have diagnoses that are impairing their function, and they have no idea because it is normal for them. They always grew up this way. They don't even realize that a different level of functioning is possible. So the best example of this is like a child with ADHD. This child is viewed as troubled. This child gets poor grades. The child thinks they're stupid. They're just like that. They think that, oh, I'm like a C student. I'm not a smart kid. I'm not good at math. So they develop a sense of normal that is based off of like some kind of mental illness, which is like untreated. The number of people who end up with diagnoses is like it's mind-boggling. Like, they're like, I had no idea that this is not normal. I had no idea that this is like treatable. Like, OCD is another good example of, there are a lot of people out there with OCD who have like no idea. They just think that that's normal.
See, that's always been my greatest fear, is that maybe my 10 out of 10 happiness is your like 6 out of 10. And my subjective experience is telling me things are normal, but they actually are not. How do you know and wake up from that to actually be able to compare yourself to some sort of true metric or get a real assessment?
So here's the first thing we can do. So in psychiatry, we have something called validated instruments, right? So we'll do research on things like questionnaires. So if someone is depressed, if we take like 100 people who say they're depressed, and then we clinically assess each of them. Can you get out of bed? Are you able to work? First thing we'll discover is there is a difference between people who feel depressed and people whose function is impaired. Out of the 100 people that are depressed, 50 of them are still able to go to work and things like that. They're not depressed, they're sad. And then the other 50%, they do feel sad, they feel depressed, and their function is impaired. So now what we know is we have a formal assessment by a psychiatrist who says, okay, I think you're depressed. Then what we did is we took those formal assessments and we tried to study, okay, what is different between these two populations? That's when we discovered that there are 3 highly specific signs of major depressive disorder, one of which is early morning awakening. At all the people who are sad, people who have a clinical diagnosis of major depressive disorder and have an episode of depression, they wake up between 4 and 5 in the morning, and their mind is usually like super anxious. So this is something that doesn't happen to someone who's had a breakup, Doesn't happen to someone who is recovering from the flu and feels kind of sad and down. Doesn't happen to people who, generally speaking, let's say you get fired from your job or something like that. So there are some features of clinical depression, clinical pathology, which are highly specific and are generally speaking found there. So early morning awakening is one of them. A second huge one that separates sadness from clinical depression is something called anhedonia. So the inability to enjoy things that you normally find enjoyable. So food just stops tasting good. You normally love to play video games or you normally love this TV show. It's just not fun for you anymore. Your brain's ability to experience pleasure feels numbed. So those kinds of things are like, will separate out someone who has a depressive episode from someone who is like sad.
Do you think that more awareness to this is good? Or can it lead to people over-identifying with this and maybe over-prescribing like, oh yeah, I've got ADHD because now more people are talking about it. That fits me.
Yeah, so it's such a complicated question. The short answer is I think we need more awareness, and arguably we need even more awareness, and I'll explain what I mean. So I recently saw a study found that 95% of TikToks related to ADHD are false. So what's happening right now is people are having impairments to their concentration, right? My ability to focus is going down.
Mm-hmm.
So then what happens is I have all kinds of normal experiences with like difficulty concentrating. I forget where my keys are. I forget to pick something up from the grocery store. I have difficulty working 8 hours a day at a stretch, which is not normal anyway, by the way. So then what happens is these are features of ADHD. And I think, oh, like because ADHD people forget their keys, if I forget my keys, that means I have ADHD. You guys see how that logical chain is like
reverse engineering it.
Yeah. This is where we use something in medicine called differential diagnosis. If we take all the people who forget their keys, not all of them have ADHD, right? So maybe 90% of people with ADHD will forget their keys, but not 90% of people who forget their keys have ADHD. This is the biggest mistake that social media is making. No one thinks about probabilities when they make a TikTok about ADHD. So what we're seeing is that there is more awareness of something called ADHD, and we're seeing like this concept get hijacked to describe, or I hate to say, excuse all kinds of relatively normal behavior. So the other really scary thing that I'm seeing is people are starting to use mental illness as an excuse. And there's like a bunch of research on this too, if you guys want to get into it. It's kind of fascinating.
I'm curious, so what's the most common excuse for mental illness that you see? And what does that get them out of?
What do you know? How do you know if it's true versus if it's just an excuse?
So this is what's beautiful, is chances are it's kind of both. So I'll give you guys a simple statistic. There's something called psychogenic non-epileptiform seizures. Okay, so psychogenic means this is not a neurological seizure. You don't have a seizure in your brain. It's someone who just goes like this. And they just go like this and they
They're
shake.
Choosing to?
Subconsciously, usually. Okay? So, but it's not a real seizure. So if you measure the electrical activity, they look like they're having a seizure, but they don't actually have a seizure. And we have a brilliant test for this. If you want to know how if someone's faking a seizure, so they'll be like flopping around. You pick up their arm and you hold it above their head. If they smack themselves in the face, they're having a real seizure. If the arm falls like this, then they're not having a real seizure. Okay.
So I don't think I'd ever like go and like think someone's faking a seizure though.
Yeah,
like,
but
I
mean that's
that would, imagine being that guy.
Yeah,
like some guy's actually having a
it.
seizure on like a bus or something. Well, hold on, everybody. Let me just
test this.
Yeah, I mean that's
they're
because
like, why did you
he's
drop?
faking.
Why did you just drop his hand like that?
It's hilarious, but yeah, I mean, so we know that there are two kinds of seizures. There are epileptiform seizures, epilepsy. These are unregulated electrical activity in the brain. And then we have psychogenic seizures, which is like someone who just starts seizing. Now, here's the really fascinating thing. 50% of people who have non-epileptiform seizures have real seizures too. So the largest population of people who fake their seizures, it's not really faking, but who fake their seizures have real epilepsy. If we think about being sick, right? If I'm sick, what does that mean for the people around me? What does that mean for my life?
They're likely going to get sick as well.
Sure. I mean, if it's infectious.
Risking it, yeah.
So let's say that I get like diagnosed with cancer. What does that mean for my life?
Anything that's going negative is a product of your cancer?
Could be. right? So what happens at work if I have cancer?
You'll use that as a reason for not doing certain things?
100%, right? I won't use it as a reason to not do. I get excused from things.
Sure.
So we as human beings, like we're doing a podcast today. If I called y'all and I said, hey guys, I'm sorry y'all flew down. I'm sick. I have the flu. What would happen?
Let's film anyway.
It'd be a lot. Yeah, it would be a whole lot better than if you're like, I'm just not feeling like it.
Right. Exactly. Right. So what happens is people who have epileptiform seizures over time, right? So like you have a 6-year-old who has a seizure and they don't go to school the next day. And so some part of their brain learns, oh, when I adopt the sick role, I get excused from certain responsibilities. When I adopt the sick role, people are compassionate to me. When I'm an asshole and I get diagnosed with cancer, people treat me nice anyway. So what we tend to see, and this is happening a lot in mental illness now, is that people they're not faking it. They may have some real mood disorder, but then they also learn how to either consciously or subconsciously like produce those symptoms to get excused from certain things. And then it's a real problem. And y'all may know people like this in your life, right? Who are like depressed. And so like sometimes the depression is real. We're not saying it's real, but also sometimes it's like convenient. Right. Like, and this is something that you really struggle with as a psychiatrist. When I have someone who's depressed and they miss their appointment, like, how do you handle that? Is this really the depression that's keeping you from the appointment? Or is it, someone who's like hungover and they just don't want to show up today?